always been terrified of. I have to strangle you all.
All right, Rubs, we're back with After Midnight Ghost Book. And the second story is Agnes Short Intercom. Tell me if the sound effects are awful as they sound. Intercom. That's a little too loud for my liking. There we go. In the background. Intercom by Agnes Short. The Shannery is a tranquil street of high walls, trees, and quiet professional houses. 450 years ago, this same Shannery contained within its high walls and dikes for defense in troublous times not only the grand cathedral church with its tower and sonorous bells, but also the bishop's palace, the prebends' lodgings with their yards and glebes, the chaplain's court or chambers, and a hospital for 12 poor men. But the great tower fell. The Reformation stripped the ancient cathedral of its statuary and gold and reduced it to the gaunt, gray proportions of a parish church. The houses of the prebends were demolished, and the houses of the gentry sold, pulled stone from stone to build up different democratic houses for the Presbyterian middle classes. The chaplain's passageway is lost, and there is a student's hall of residence where the bishop's palace stood. But somewhere under the vaulted precast concrete of the modern dining hall, the old town draw well still holds its secrets and the buried bodies of men. The hospital, too, has disappeared, and what remains of the chaplain's court is an ordinary private house. Pardon? Is this light on? Yes. Or so Margaret Ford believed until she stood on the doorstep in a night of drenching rain and looked up at the great blank wall above her. It was a wall of dead windows, the larger blinded by shutters, the smaller by stones and cement. Can you hear that sound? It's a record playing through there. Trying to get some sound effects in the background. Bricked up how many years ago, by whom, and why? The rain glistened on the pitted quarters of a heraldic crest set into the wall above a small barred window. The girl made out beyond the darkness the crude outline of a boar's head, castles and Latin, picked out in scraps of scarlet and gold. Hope, lingering hopelessly on, she thought, with unexpected sadness. Beneath the crest there was the bricked-in crescent of what must once have been an arch, and a window embrasure at ankle level told her the walls were 4 feet thick. The raindrops which clung to the rough stone of the walls were dark and moist, like blood, except where the gleam from a street lamp rounded them briefly with light. The glistening street stretched on either side of her, silent and empty between high, crenellated walls. The only sound was the steady drip, drip of moisture from the overhanging trees, and somewhere in a faraway street, an echoing footstep, which receded deliberately into silence. The girl shivered, pulled her cloak more tightly around her, and rang the bell again. The door opened, and light flooded the steps. I'm so sorry. I hope you haven't been ringing for ages, but we can't hear the bell upstairs or downstairs, come to that. One of the penalties of living in a big house. The man was thin, with the nervous thinness of the ascetic. He was good looking in a famished way, especially now in dinner jacket and black tie. The girl stepped over the threshold and shook herself like a timid animal. Rain showered the hall with diamonds. Let me take your coat. Professor Adams lifted the dark cloak from her shoulders. His wife, descending the stair in her sensible black dress with the beading at the neck, felt an uncomfortable jolt of the heart when she rounded the last landing and saw them standing there. Her husband dark, thin, intense, and the girl, she could find no words to describe the girl. In her simple, timeless gown of crimson wool, belted loosely at the waist, and her black straight hair, she was at the same time innocence and danger. Joan Adams shook away the fear and stepped briskly down the last few steps. I'll show you where everything is, dear, she said with a professional smile. She opened the door, and they descended below street level to a low beamed room of oak and brass and rough stone walls. We like the bare stone, she explained. It's the original structure down here, all 16th century. The floor's intact too, but I'm afraid I drew the line at stone flags, even for history's sake. Just so you know, I'm not killing people here. This is the intercom, she went on, indicating a small box on the dresser. The walls are so thick, it's impossible to hear them without it. So keep it switched on, then you'll hear if one of them wakes. The kitchen is this way. She led the girl out of the beamed room by a second door into an arched scullery. This is the old coach entrance, Mrs. Adams explained. They need to drive in this way to the courtyard. I expect you saw the crest on the wall outside. It really was a court in the old days, you see. 4 sides of a square and 4 towers, one at each corner. The piece we live in is all that's left. Who lived here? Asked the girl. Here? Originally 20 chaplains from the cathedral, and a hard time they must have had, too. All sorts of rigid rules, doors barred at 8 o'clock, and no women, of course. They still went in for celibacy in those days, though I expect some of them managed to get round it just the same, don't you? The girl didn't answer. She was looking upwards to the arched dimness of the ceiling, where there was a huge iron hook. That's where they hung the lanterns, said Mrs. Adams. And men, too, I wouldn't wonder. Here's the kitchen, she went on, going up 3 steps to the next room. I've left everything ready. There's coffee and sandwiches and so on when you want them. I think that's about all. I've locked the back door. In a house like this, where everything is so spread out, you have to be careful. You'd never hear if anyone came in uninvited. Not that they ever would, she continued hastily. Good baby-sitters were rare and precious, but it's best to be careful. Now I'll just show you where the children are. They passed back through the arch of the scullery and the low-beamed living room, up narrow stairs to the front hall, and upwards again to the open doorway of a shuttered room. The girl looked quickly into the darkness. Shadows, 2 beds, 2 sleeping shapes, more shadows. What do I do if they wake? She whispered. They won't. They never do. But if by any chance something should disturb them, give them a drink of orange juice and tell them a little story. Reassure them that we'll be back soon. I've left a note of where we're going. As Margaret nodded, something made her glance over her shoulder. A movement or a stir of cold air. Behind her, a shadowed corridor stretched to a short flight of steps. More doors. Stairs climbed upwards into narrow, creaking darkness. The uncurtained window of the landing showed her nothing but her own outline, a small, slim girl with flowing hair and a long dress. The dim landing flickered back from the glass like candle flame against the night. Somewhere on the floor above them, a board creaked. A window rattled softly in its frame. Is the rest of the house empty? Asked the girl, timidly. There's no one else in, if that's what you mean, said Mrs. Adams. Only you and the children. But there's nothing to worry about. Joan, called a voice from the hall. We'll be late. Coming. They descended to the front hall. I was just showing Margaret the ropes. Now, she added, turning to the girl, are you sure you'll be all right? There's television and so on, said John Adams vaguely. Books. Help yourself. Make yourself at home. Thank you, but I'm going to try and get some work done. It's so noisy in my digs. And I've that essay of yours to finish. Good girl, said Adams. You'll find it quite enough here, and you can use any of my reference books you like. Oh, and if you do hear noises, don't worry. It's only the central heating. Outside in the car, Mrs. Adams turned worriedly to her husband. Are you sure she's all right? She hardly spoke a word, and she looked so frail, almost unreal. That's ridiculous. That ridiculous dress and all that hair, and her eyes. She looks as if she lives in a different world. She's all right, a bit tense perhaps, but sensible enough. Things have been getting too much for her lately, that's all. Overwork, depression, end of term nerves. You know the sort of thing, and her digs sound pretty grim. She jumped at the chance of an evening on her own. Yes, but the children, you do think, for Christ's sake, Joan, stop fussing. You want to go to the party, don't you? I thought that was the whole point, and you said yourself there was no one else. Yes, I know, and you did very well to find anyone at all. But she gives me the creeps. You don't think she's on drugs, do you? I have not the slightest idea. Would you like me to go back and ask her? His wife ignored the sarcasm. It's her eyes, I think. When I saw her standing on the doorstep in the rain with that cloak to her feet and the hood, I had the ridiculous idea that she'd found her way into the wrong century. She's certainly brilliant on 16th century poetry, agreed Adams, especially the love poems, which is odd because I gather she has no time for boys. Oh? Mrs. Adams pricked up her ears. Not girls instead? Of course not. John Adams felt unreasonably angry on the girl's behalf. There's nothing at all abnormal about her. In fact, she's a particularly feminine and attractive girl. I had the impression that her fellow students just don't interest her. Perhaps it's you she's after, said Joan Adams with a laugh, but her voice had an edge which made her husband jam his foot down hard on the accelerator and set his teeth. The party had better be good. The girl stood in the middle of the room and waited until the car engine disappeared into the distance. She stood a moment longer listening to the silence. Then she began to move slowly around the room, touching the rough stone of the walls with reverent fingers, tracing the outline of the ancient beams. There was a Jacobean chest, a refectory table, and a row of leather-bound books. Campion, Lyly, Sir Philip Sidney. She took one out, opened it, and read aloud at random, Joy to the person of my love. Her voice moved like velvet in the silence. Suddenly her heart swelled, and she laughed softly. She spread her skirts, dipped to the carpeted floor in a sweeping curtsy, and began to pace the first stately steps of a galliard. Somewhere far away and faint she heard a lute pluck sweetly in time to her dance. The girl paused, listened, but there was nothing. Wishful thinking, she said aloud and sighed, and this won't get that essay written. She opened her bag and took out papers, a chip file, and a sheaf of notes, which she spread out in front of her on the refectory table. She turned off the main light and sat down at the table in the small golden pool of the reading lamp. She wrote a careful headline, The Sacred and the Profane in 16th Century Poetry, and began to work. It was some time before she noticed the music, but gradually she became aware that somewhere beyond the black and white clarity of the written word there was sound and light. Somewhere the soft, plucking beauty of a lute was stringing the darkness with gold. The girl's hand stopped, and she looked up. Her eyes probed the shadows of the room, listening. The lamplight splashed the surface of the polished wood with gold, But on the edge of that light, the shadows held only shapes, formless and unknown. The notes dropped on like needles now into the silence. They were the same measured notes of the Galliard. The girl's heart beat painfully fast until the crimson wool trembled over her breasts. Then a draft knifed under the ill-fitting door, and the floor beneath her struck cold as stone. She pushed back her chair and stood up, holding her body rigid and tensing slender fingers against the oak of the table. But the music had stopped. She listened for an endless minute until the room seemed to fill with the patter of rain on leaves and the creak of silence. But there was nothing else, only against her cheek a puff of cold air like a dead kiss. The girl shuddered. She straightened her papers with nervous, unseeing hands, while her eyes searched the shadows. At last she sat down and deliberately forced herself to concentrate on the carefully written page. The conflict of divine and human love, woman on the one hand as Mary, on the other as Eve, the temptress. The fleeting nature of beauty and human love contrasted with the permanence of heaven. Heaven in those days, she thought, was an unquestioned and coveted goal. Damnation must have seemed a very real danger, with one's own eternity at stake. Men might well have been driven to monstrous deeds to preserve the hope intact. She had made a marginal note to remind herself to follow up the point and decided to strengthen her spirits with coffee and something to eat. She opened the second door, stepped quickly out under the vaulted arch and the hook, then up the 3 short steps to the kitchen. While she waited for the kettle to boil, the girl went over and over the essay as she had written it so far. There was still, she knew, something that evaded her, but it would come. Professor Adams was good. Some said brilliant, but there was an aspect of 16th century literature which the girl felt had escaped even him. It was not a question of intellect or understanding or even of research. It was something more nebulous than that, something she could only describe as feeling. As she stirred the milky liquid in her cup, the girl realized with a strange sense of loneliness that she was more in tune with the period than he was. It was then that she heard the voices. They came from the room she had left and seemed to be arguing, one pleading, the other younger, protesting. It must be the intercom. The children have woken up. She left her cup on the dresser and hurried out of the kitchen, back to the living room. Sure enough, faint, blurred voices were coming from the intercom on the dresser. She flicked the switch to make sure, and the voices stopped. She flicked it on again, and the indistinguishable murmur resumed. She scurried out of the room and upstairs, but at the door of the children's room she stopped, listening, wondering how she was going to deal with these 2 unknowns. But she heard nothing, until, as she stood tense and receptive, straining to hear, the sound of steady, peaceful breathing reaching her ears from beyond the darkness. Someone talking in his sleep, she decided, and tiptoed quietly downstairs. But she had scarcely regained the kitchen and picked up her cup when the voices resumed. Then the music. It was the same tune, but this time they were words in a soft tenor voice which caressed the silence with persuasive sweetness. Joy to the person of my love, although she me disdain. Fixed are my thoughts and may not move, and yet I love in vain. The lute played unmistakably in the background. The girl stood immobile, listening, while her eyes grew larger and darker in the pale oval of her face. She put down the cup with trembling deliberation and moved slowly towards the door. The skirts of her crimson gown brushed softly over the stone flags of the floor, and her breath was like the mist in the cold air. But the beamed room was empty. She crossed to the dresser and put out a hand. The small grid of the intercom was warm to the touch. With fumbling fingers, the grief switched it off. The girl switched it off, not the grief. She stood a long moment with her hand on the set, waiting, while the silence taunted her with shadows. I'll leave it switched off, she decided. That will stop them. Then Mrs. Adams' voice came back to her, competent and firm. Keep the set switched on, otherwise you'll never hear them. At last, submissively, the girl's fingers moved to the switch. This time the result was instant and unmistakable. Margaret ran into the kitchen, snatched up the phone with hands which trembled uncontrollably, and fumbled at the dial. As she waited for someone to answer, she glanced over her shoulder through the open door across the gloom of the vaulted scullery to the low-beamed silence of that other room and the intercom. Mary? Mary, listen. Is that you, Margaret? The voice sounded aggrieved. What on earth's the matter? I was just washing my hair. There's something odd, began Margaret anxiously, glancing over her shoulder to those alien shadows. How do you mean, odd? Look, I'm dripping all over the carpet. Hang on a sec while I get a towel. In the waiting silence, the music came clearly across the distance, but as soon as Mary spoke again, it stopped. Okay, now, what's going on? I'm not sure, but I keep hearing music that isn't there. There was a snort from the other end. You been at the prof's whiskey? No, honestly, Mary, it's true. It's coming over the intercom. A man singing. It's probably the next-door neighbor in his bath. With a lute accompaniment? His wife playing to him as he soaks. Who lives next door anyway? But it's not that kind of music, Mary. It's personal, as if he's singing to me. She paused, tense and waiting. Yes, there it is again. Can't you hear it? Not a thing, said Mary cheerfully. Look, Meg, you can pick up all sorts of things on an intercom. Radio transmissions, other people's TV, voices in the road. Just forget it. Haven't you a book to read? Yes, but... Then why not make yourself some coffee, put your feet up, and enjoy it? I'd come around to keep you company, only I'm in the middle of setting my hair. The girl didn't answer. Are you still there, Meg? You're not having one of your moods again, are you? I don't think so, but... Look, Meg, don't worry. It's somebody's record, that's all. But if you really want me to come over, I will. No, of course not, said Margaret humbly. You finish your hair. I'll be all right. Slowly, she replaced the receiver and stood, listening. Now, there was nothing at all but the huge, silken silence of the night. She picked up the cup of coffee and walked deliberately back into the living room. She put the cup carefully on the table and sat down. But she made no attempt to work. Instead, she sat weary and rigid, waiting. 5 long minutes passed. At last, when nothing happened, she picked up her pen and began to read over what she had written. She read through almost 5 pages before she heard the weeping, soft, insistent, heartbroken. The poor little things, they must be having a nightmare, and she'd been so absorbed she hadn't even heard them. She flung back her chair and sped upstairs, but at the door of the children's room she stopped dead. There was no sound except the steady rise and fall of breathing. Carefully she tiptoed into the room and stood looking down at the 2 sleeping shapes. A bad dream, she told herself. It must have been. She slipped out of the room and moved reluctantly downstairs. At the door of the living room she stopped. From inside the room came the same unmistakable sound of a woman weeping. I can bear it no longer, followed by a heartbroken sob. Then a man's voice, loving, anguished. Do not tempt me. The girl's heart flipped painfully. She leaned, gasping, against the wall while her trembling fingers plucked at the stone for support. She must be going mad. Mad! The wooden door at her face seemed an entrance to a different world, and she was incapable of moving away. A cold draft stirred the folds of her skirt, and she felt the hair on the nape of her neck rise. On either side of her stretched flagged floors, stone walls, and silent shadows. Here stood the common hall of the chaplains 400 years ago. Here, 20 priests had eaten together in candlelight and celibacy, night after night until death, until eternity. Margaret felt terror rising like a scream in her throat. She pressed back against the rough wall while her eyes searched the darkness fearfully, probing, probing. Shadows stirred, a draught lifted the hem of her skirt and passed coldly on. Somewhere a window rattled. From the depths of the ancient passageway came a whisper like the breath of time. My dearest. The girl broke away from the wall and fled. Through the living room, through the scullery, to the telephone on the kitchen wall. She clutched the instruments with the wild hands and dialed the number that Mrs. Adams had left her. She heard the phone shrill on, regular and strident, like the beat of her own heart, but there was no reply. At a successful party, records and conviviality drown all sounds except their own. After 5 endless minutes, the girl gave in. She dropped the phone back on its hook and stood with head and shoulders bowed while tears of despair beaded her cheeks. She could fight alone no longer. If no one would help her, there was nothing for her but to give in. She moved slowly back into the living room and stood submissively beside the intercom, waiting. The small rectangle quivered soundlessly in the silence. The girl listened and waited, while her fingers twisted restlessly in the strands of her belt. She heard breathing, the tiny creak of an infant turning over in bed, a childish mumble, then faint at first but growing steadily closer, came the swish of cloth on stone, of sandaled feet. The breathing grew louder and louder. Dearest, no, gasped the girl, as she felt cold breath brush her cheek, her breast. Please, no, I can't bear it. She backed away across the room, her hands outstretched. Pleading, the voice strengthened until it filled the stone-flagged hall. Do not tempt me. Later, softly came the song. Oh, woe is me that ever I did see the beauty that did me bewitch. The notes of the lute swelled and reverberated through the room until they seemed to soak into the very stone. Funny, said Mrs. Adams, she's not here. They had let themselves into the house in the small hours with a careful key. I'll see if she's upstairs. Professor Adams drifted vaguely in a haze of alcoholic good humor towards the table, where his fuddled brain had recognized something he knew. An essay. Good girl, she's been busy. A sweet child. Here woman is seen as the temptress who must be. His smile became puzzled. The essay ended in mid-sentence, and at the foot of the page were 3 scrawled words in different ink. Farewell, my dearest. His wife appeared in the doorway. She's not upstairs either, she said worriedly. She pushed past him towards the kitchen, but as she opened the door to the scullery, something soft brushed against her face. John, she screamed, she's here. Together they looked upwards, appalled at the crimson gown, the pale dead face and flowing hair which hung from the lantern hook by a twisted cord, a tasseled silken cord, such as was worn in olden times by a novice priest. That's the end of that story. The Midnight Ghost Book.